and a major con was that there were these selection effects that could potentially make the optimal theta above 0, and there was these cream skimming things that could be particularly destructive. Another reason why you might want to try to keep theta down or keep things unconcentrated is you're afraid of people assembling too much political or cultural power, and you're afraid that they might use that for purposes that are dangerous. A second thing is that I'm not quite sure what I was trying to say there. I think this might be related to your problem set, so I won't go too much into that. A third thing is that in financial markets, firms that are very concentrated might become too big to fail, and that might carry costs with it as well. Some of the cons of competition policy are that, number 2 is basically very related to the problem 2 on your problem set, so I'll just let you guys figure that out. A second reason, some reasons why you might not want competition policy is that it obviously could impede economies of scale or people profiting from the innovations that they create. So that was like the intellectual property lecture that we had. Another reason why you might want to allow people to coordinate their behavior, which it doesn't necessarily raise theta, it could actually lower theta, is there might be complementarities between people's products rather than them being substitutes. And in that case, coordination could actually help them lower their prices. A third reason might be that policy that's trying to drive down theta might actually get in the way of it being driven down sometimes, because if theta rises, that might encourage more firms to enter the market and drive theta back down again. Okay, now most competition policy ignores most of these factors and just thinks about the most basic static distortion, but I think that there's a lot of work to be done in this area. And nonetheless, the sort of conventional wisdom is the logic of Cournot's theorem, this thing of driving prices down to cost, is like the main thing, and all these other things are sort of small in comparison. And that was the motivation for the Clayton Antitrust Act. Now, the Sherman Antitrust Act prevented illegal combinations or cartels, but the Clayton Act restricts even legal combinations and mergers. Okay. So the traditional rationale of why we shouldn't just block all mergers is because of economies of scale, not these other reasons why we might want to reduce the amount of competition. So like an example of this was, growing the AT&T network might make reception better, right? So agencies thus have to weigh the anti-competitive effects that a merger might have of raising theta against the pro-competitive or socially beneficial effects they have of taking advantage of economies of scale. Now, there are several agencies that have responsibility for antitrust policy, but there are 2 that are sort of like primarily in charge in the United States. Daiichi, what are those?
Department of Justice.
Yeah.
And Federal Trade Commission.
That's right. Absolutely. So the Department of Justice Antitrust Division and the Federal Trade Commission. And merging companies in the United States have to notify these agencies of their intentions to merge. And the agencies subpoena data from these companies in several stages. So first they have to submit like an initial request, which says, look, we're going to merge. And then the agency has maybe 30 days to review that. And then they say, OK, this looks, for most of them, they say that's fine. For a few of them, they say this looks suspicious. You should give us a lot more information. We're going to do it for 6 months, right? And then they have a team of about 150 PhD economists between them. Maybe one day one of you guys will actually go work for them. And they try to analyze whether there's a problem. If there's a problem, what they usually do is just say to the company, there's a problem, give it up. And the companies usually give it up at that point. Or they'll say, there's a problem, but we can fix it by you divesting some part of the companies that was competing, and then they force them to divest those, and then it goes forward. And in a rare occasion, it actually goes to court. And that was starting to happen with the AT&T T-Mobile merger, but then they decided to just give up because it's pretty hard to fight the Justice Department. Okay. So in some ways, antitrust regulation is probably the most sophisticated economic regulation in the world. And it's been copied by most developing countries. Europe, which used to make cartel agreements legal, is now one of the world leaders in competition policy. Also, most of the Commonwealth countries, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, are very active in competition policy. On the other hand, in developing countries, it's much more primitive. In many, there's not even a law against mergers, including in Peru. In others, there is a law, but in reality, it's not very well enforced. Some have some sort of a structure to enforce it, but they don't have much economic analysis behind it. So for example, Colombia is still writing the guidelines, and if you're interested in what's going on in developing countries on this, there's going to be a conference in the winter here about antitrust policy in Latin America. And a few developing countries are trying to get sophisticated. So for example, China is quite sophisticated, Brazil is very sophisticated, Chile is fairly sophisticated. But it's very heterogeneous, the institutions of this around the world. And my personal view is that if you're really interested in antitrust policy, rather than working just on the United States, where things are sort of gotten to a point where it's like tweaking along the edges, thinking about like what these institutions could or should be in developing countries, I think is a really interesting question. Okay. Now, the traditional evaluation of mergers was based on industry concentration. And to do this, they would basically take a whole group of companies and try to treat them as if they were a single product. Eric, what was the way that they tried to like group things together in products? What was that what's that process called?
Labeling? I don't know.
This is by the antitrust agencies when they're reviewing a merger.
Oh, right. Yeah, I'm not sure.
It's called market definition. And what they would try to do is define the boundaries of which products belong to be lumped into this single, product industry, right? So what they do is they start with the merging product, the two merging companies. So for example, there was a merger between Whole Foods and Wild Oats. And they said, first, let's consider an industry that's just those two firms. And then they try to add the firms that are the closest substitutes for those products, both in terms of geographically where the products are sold and in terms of the type of product that's being sold, how similar it is. So like you might, after Wild Oats and Whole Foods, add like other organic grocery stores, and then you might add other high-end grocery stores. And then you might add all grocery stores, right? And you keep adding companies until you are convinced that a person who controlled all those firms would impose a substantial but small and non-transitory increase in prices. So, or it's small but substantial and non-transitory increase in prices, which was a terminology of the Supreme Court that's effectively been interpreted as 5% for 1 year. Okay. Then, once you define that industry, you would try to measure the concentration within that industry. And Kentaro, how would people measure concentration within an industry? What are the standard metrics of that?
The sum of the share square.
Yeah, that's right. That's called the Hirschman Index, or HHI. And you define the share of each firm as the fraction of sales within the industry that firm has. And the HHI is then the sum of the square of the shares. It's basically a share-weighted average of what share the firms have, right? And then you multiply it by 10,000. 1 over H not multiplied by 10,000 is sort of a measure of how many firms there are in the industry. Because if you had 5 firms in the industry, right, and they all had the same share, then the HHI would be 0.2. And then multiply it by 1,000, it would be 2,000. And so if you believe the Bresnahan and race reasoning, we should start getting worried when sort of the effective number of firms, 1 over the HHI, is 3 to 5. So that's somewhere between 2,000 and 3,300. You can also relate this to what happens in a Cournot industry and to some analysis that was done by Stigler about how much collusion is possible depending on the number of firms. So the way you relate it to Cournot is to notice that in a Cournot industry, every firm sets the markup equal to P prime times their number of units that that firm has, which is the same as price over the elasticity of demand times their share. And so the share-weighted average of the markups is exactly the Herfindahl-Hirschman index over epsilon. OK, so mergers that cause the traditional analysis of the Justice Department was that mergers that caused H to go over 1,800 or that raised it by 300 points would trigger an investigation. And 2,000 was sort of the lower end of our range over here. So the Bresnahan and race analysis would suggest that this was a little too sensitive, but that was the standard that was traditionally used. Now, unfortunately, in practice, this proved a very Vishank? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I was wondering, like, how does this like index fit with like Zipf's law? And one of the questions on the exam.
Yeah.
And like, how does it does it incorporate that, or like how do you distinguish?
Well, yeah. So I mean, this increased concentration will obviously be more likely the more unequal the firm's market share is, right? But and that has been one reason why people think that sort of concentrated industries are less competitive. But I also think that as you make an industry like more evenly sized, that's an indicator that they're trying to collude. So the use of these concentration industries is a little bit indices is a little bit awkward. So and that was sort of what that question was starting to get at. So unfortunately, this approach has proved pretty cumbersome in practice. And the main reason is that market definition requires you to just say, like, a firm is in the industry or it's not in the industry. So like if you put all grocery stores into the industry with Wild Oats and Whole Foods, their shares are tiny, and their merger makes no difference. But should you say that those firms are not a substitute at all for this product? Well, no, that doesn't seem right either. And the truth is that most products are imperfect substitutes for each other. They're not the exact same product, but they're also not completely irrelevant, right? And market definition required this very sharp distinction. The other thing is that the relevance of concentration is somewhat ambiguous. In fact, the most valuable mergers are in a Cournot industry are the ones that increase the concentration the most, because the firms that merge, they get a lot of efficiencies, and so they increase production, right? So actually things that increase concentration might be the most valuable mergers, and ones that reduce concentration might actually be the worst, because they are by like big companies that reduce their production, right? Okay, so recently the merger guidelines that are issued by the agencies to guide how they evaluate mergers have moved away from this, right? So basically, these merger guidelines, which were first written in the early 80s, are supposed to be an official guide to companies about how the agencies will go about evaluating mergers so the companies can plan for whether their merger will be approved or not. And these have been issued roughly every 10 years since the 1980s. The latest one was in 2010, and that was the one that I was involved with. And there are similar things in the UK and the EU. In 1992, those guidelines were purely based on HHI and market definition. And the new ones emphasize a logic that we're going to go through in a minute, which explicitly incorporates product differentiation. These guidelines were